Last winter, I took up cross-country skiing as a way to get outside and clear my head. There's a state park about an hour from where I live, with miles of trails that cut through thick snow-covered forest. It's usually quiet, and you can go hours without seeing another person, especially on weekdays. One afternoon, I decided to go out later than usual. I wanted to catch the sunset, thinking it'd be peaceful to ski back in the twilight. The park was empty when I arrived, the snow untouched, and the sky a dull gray as the sun started dipping toward the horizon. I set off on one of the longer trails, gliding through the silence. My breath fogged up in the cold air. The only sound was the crunch of my skis over the snow. After about an hour, I stopped to take a break. The woods were so still, it almost felt unnatural. No wind, no animals, not even the creak of trees in the cold. Just me and the endless stretch of white. That's when I noticed them. Tracks in the snow. At first, I thought they were from a deer or maybe a coyote. But as I looked closer, I realized they were boot prints. Heavy, deliberate steps heading in the same direction as me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone else had been out earlier, but I hadn't seen another car in the parking lot, and the tracks looked fresh. No snow had fallen into them yet. I kept going, but the prints stuck in my mind. They weren't alongside the ski trail. They cut through the woods, following it parallel, but just far enough into the trees that I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't stopped. The light started to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft purples and blues. I decided it was time to turn back, not wanting to risk skiing in the dark. That's when I saw them again. The boot prints had shifted. They weren't just following the trail anymore. They crossed it. My trail. And they were heading back the way I'd come. My stomach knotted. Someone had walked across the ski trail behind me, maybe while I was stopped earlier. But I hadn't heard a thing. Not a crunch of snow, not a single sound. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, but every step I took felt heavier, like the woods were closing in on me. The trees were darker now, shadows stretching out like long fingers across the snow. As I rounded a bend, my breath caught in my throat. The tracks were back. This time, they were in front of me, crossing the trail again. Whoever it was, they weren't just following me. They were moving in loops, circling me, like they were trying to stay out of sight. Panic set in. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was on skis, and running wasn't an option. I kept going, pushing myself harder, heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I saw the trailhead in the distance. Relief washed over me as the small wooden sign came into view, marking the end of the trail. I practically stumbled into the parking lot, fumbling to get my skis off. That's when I noticed it. My car, sitting alone in the lot, had fresh boot prints leading right up to the driver's side door. I didn't wait to figure out who it was. I jumped in, locked the doors, and tore out of there, my hands shaking on the wheel. It was a quiet winter weekend, and I decided to rent a small cabin to get away from the city. It was a basic place, just a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a bed. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors. Exactly what I needed. The first day went as planned. I read by the fire, took a short walk in the snow, and made myself a simple dinner. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped dramatically, so I stayed inside and listened to the wind howl through the trees. Around midnight, I heard something strange. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint sound, almost like a door creaking. I froze, straining to hear. It came again, this time louder. I grabbed the flashlight and checked the front door. Locked. The windows were shut tight too. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I turned to head back to bed, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the floor, near the corner of the room, were faint, wet footprints. Bare footprints. I tried to tell myself they were mine, that I must have tracked in snow earlier, but they were too large, and I'd been wearing boots all day. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with my flashlight in hand. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I packed up and left without looking back. Later, I checked the cabin's listing to leave a review. That's when I noticed a comment from another renter. Beautiful spot, but someone was staying in the crawl space. Be careful. It was one of those bitterly cold winter nights, the kind where your breath hisses and freezes the second it touches the air, sharp enough to sting. I was driving home from work, taking the back roads because the highway was jammed after the storm. No streetlights, no other cars, just me and my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. About 30 minutes from home, my car started acting up. First, the engine light blinked, then the heater began to blow icy cold air. I muttered a curse under my breath, praying it would hold out until I got to town. But it didn't. A few minutes later, everything just shut down. The engine sputtered, then died. All the lights went out. The heater stopped. The only sound was the wind howling outside. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal, just my luck. The cold was seeping into my bones, and the temperature was dropping fast. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as a truck slowly pulled up behind my car. A man got out and walked up to my window. He looked like he was in his 40s, bundled up in a thick jacket and hat. He smiled and tapped on the glass. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. I nodded, explaining what had happened. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station, about 10 miles away. I hesitated. It felt risky, but the cold was unbearable, and I didn't have another choice. I grabbed my bag and got into his truck. It was old, smelling faintly of gasoline. The man seemed friendly enough, asking where I was headed and what had happened with my car. But as we drove, something felt off. "We're not going to the gas station," I said, my voice trembling a bit. He glanced at me, expression neutral. "Shortcut," he replied, almost too casually. My stomach tightened. I looked out the window. Nothing. No houses, no lights, just endless trees. My heart started pounding. I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. "Where are we going?" I asked again, this time louder, almost a demand. He didn't answer. My pulse was racing now. I was trying to think, to figure out what to do, but before I could react, the truck slowed down and pulled off onto a narrow, snowy path. He stopped the truck and turned to me, his face stone cold. "You're going to want to get out now," he said, his voice flat. Then, he opened his door and stepped out. I didn't waste a second. My hand shot for the lock and flipped it up just as he opened my door. I bolted out of the truck, slipping and stumbling in the snow. I don't know how long I ran or how I got away, but eventually, I found myself on the highway, waving down a passing car. When the police found my car the next day, they also found footprints leading from the driver's side into the woods. I was house-sitting for my aunt in her cabin up north. She'd gone on a week-long vacation and asked me to keep an eye on the place while she was gone. The cabin is pretty isolated, surrounded by thick woods and miles away from the nearest neighbor. It's the kind of quiet you don't really get in the city. During winter, the snow covers everything. The driveway, the trees, the roof. It's beautiful, but eerie. There's something about the way sound disappears in the snow. No cars, no people, just silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the wood stove, read a little, and fell asleep early. But on the second night, something strange happened. I woke up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. No loud noises, no alarms. Maybe I just had to use the bathroom. So, I got up, grabbed my phone for light, and walked through the dark living room toward the small bathroom at the back of the cabin. As I passed the large window in the living room, I stopped. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something outside. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. Footprints. They were in the snow, perfectly clear, leading straight up to the front porch. I froze. My brain immediately started trying to make sense of it. It had snowed earlier that day. Light, fluffy snow. And I knew for a fact I hadn't been outside since the afternoon. I hadn't heard a car, no knock on the door, nothing. So, who had been outside? I flicked on the porch light. It cast a yellow glow across the snow, and I leaned close to the window, squinting into the dark. I expected to see someone, maybe a lost hiker, maybe a prankster, but there was no one, just the tracks. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I grabbed my flashlight, unlocked the door, and cracked it open just a few inches. Cold air hit my face as I aimed the light at the footprints. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps didn't just come to the door. They circled the cabin, over and over again. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and double-checked all the windows. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination. Maybe an animal had walked through the snow, and I was seeing things wrong. But no animal walks in a perfect circle around a house. I sat on the couch with my flashlight close by, staring at the front door. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just some kid messing around. But at 2 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, that didn't sit right. The night felt endless. I didn't sleep again. I just sat there, staring at the window, listening for any sound outside. But the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my coat and boots and went outside to look more closely. I followed the tracks carefully, flashlight still in hand, even though it was daylight now. The snow made everything look untouched, except for those footprints. I followed them away from the cabin, toward the woods. The trees loomed ahead, their bare branches reaching out like bony fingers. But then, I noticed something strange. The tracks just stopped. There were no signs of someone turning around, no trail leading back out of the trees. It was like whoever, or whatever, made those tracks had walked straight into the forest and disappeared. I stood there, staring at the empty woods, trying to figure it out. How does someone walk into the middle of the snow and just vanish? I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. I went back inside, packed up my things, and left the cabin a day early. I didn't tell my aunt exactly what happened when she came back. I just said I got spooked. She laughed it off, said the woods can play tricks on you during the winter. But I know what I saw. It was one of those bitter winter nights where the cold seeps into your bones, no matter how high you turn the heat. I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone, a blanket draped over my shoulders. Outside, the snow fell in heavy flakes, coating the backyard in a perfect untouched layer of white. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Around midnight, I decided to make some tea. As I walked into the kitchen, I passed the large window that faced the backyard. I glanced outside, almost out of habit. That's when I saw it. A face. For a moment, I thought it was just the reflection of something inside, maybe the light hitting the glass in a strange way. But then I realized it was outside. A man's face, pale and still, staring directly at me through the window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with him. He didn't move, didn't blink. It was like he wasn't even alive. Slowly, I backed away, my heart pounding. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The backyard lit up, the snow reflecting the glow. The face was gone. I stood there for a few seconds, staring out at the empty yard. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. But something about it felt wrong. I went back to the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like boots on snow. I froze, listening. It was coming from the backyard. Slowly, I crept back to the kitchen window and peeked outside. At first, I saw nothing. The yard was still and silent, the snow undisturbed. But as I scanned the area, my stomach dropped. Footprints. They started at the edge of the yard and led straight to the window, but there were no prints leading back. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady. They arrived about 20 minutes later, searched the property, and found nothing. But one of the officers noticed something that made my blood run cold. "The snow on the windowsill," he said, pointing. I looked closer. The snow there had been disturbed, smudged, like someone had leaned against the glass. Whoever it was. They had been standing there, pressed against the window, watching me.